evening, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on European history. And as you can see, we are today discussing the fourth segment of Reformation, the movement in 16th century Europe. We have earlier spoken about the overview picture of Reformation. We have spoken about the general intellectual, political, economic and social conditions in which this movement emerged. We have spoken about Calvinism, we have spoken about Lutheran religion, and today we would be talking about the other two variants of Reformation movement, the Anabaptism and the Catholic, or what also came to be known as Counter-Reformation. So some historians don't quite include Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation as part of Reformation, because they think that Reformation is essentially about efforts to reform the problems that had crept into the Catholic Church. So how can reforms from within Catholicism be a part of it? But as we would discuss today, that Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation in its entirety is not only about the reaction to Reformation, but there were attempts being made within Catholic Church to reform itself even prior to or without any connection with what was happening at the behest of, say, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli and so forth. So the reformist push to the Catholic religion to reform itself is just one part of the story. There were several attempts even prior to the beginning of Reformation to modify, to bring about some kind of a change within Catholic Church. So these are some of the issues that we would be talking about. Now, coming specifically, since we have already discussed about Lutheran and Calvinist or Reformed Church, let's try and understand the other variant that we get to see in some parts of Europe, and that is Anabaptism. Or in simple terms, it is the radical phase of the Reformation. So while Luther represented a conservative phase of Reformation because he allied with the German princes and so forth, Anabaptism was to the opposite of it, although they were both trying to bring about reforms in Catholic Church or Catholic religion, but Anabaptism is about a more radical phase of Reformation. Now, from 1520s up to 17th century, Anabaptism in some way or the other kept some parts of Europe busy in terms of what they had to contribute and the kind of opposition that they invited. Now, literally, Anabaptism means rebaptizers. So we will see as to what it actually means, but more important than that is to understand its radical nature. And on account of its radicalism, many did not regard it as a Reformation, because it stood for religious democracy, whereas the Christian Church or Catholic Church was basically arranged in some form of hierarchy of authority. That is how Christendom worked till around the Middle Ages. Against all kinds of religious order, it was Anabaptists were against any kind of religious order, and they even regarded only Bible as sacrosanct, to the complete dismissal of other texts as sacred and so forth. The origin of Anabaptism is not entirely clear, but in Switzerland, certainly it was initiated by Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, and the states to begin with wanted to crush it. hence it acquired some kind of political attention, and that added the political dimension to this movement as well. They believed that church or the state had no right to determine the faith of the people, no punishment on breach of faith. They looked down upon military services. They said no to tax, or they advocated against taxing any state that is engaged in war. So whatever religious tax or otherwise that people were paying, the Anabaptists exhorted upon the people of these states not to give taxes if they were engaged in war, if these states were engaged in war. And of course they were against the tithe or the church tax. So this particular set of ideas and ideals with which Anabaptists operated give you an insight into the radical character of what they were preaching. And of course states or civil authorities would not take it very lightly. So they always were on the lookout to crush it somehow. If we look at the social base of Anabaptism, as we did for Lutheran and Calvinist or Reformed movement, we find that Anabaptism or radical Reformation is more premised on the support of the literate and the bourgeoisie, and they were mostly settled in the Low Countries who on repression had gone to different parts of Europe. So Low Countries here would mean Holland and adjoining areas. Now in Netherlands, Charles V ordered for burning of some 30,000 Anabaptists, and that tells you about the approach of the state to Anabaptists or radical reformers. As a result of this hard stance of Charles V, some of the Anabaptists fled and they entered English politics. Here they were, I would say, not very impactful as such, and they were referred to by different names like levelers, diggers. Overall, of course, their outlook was democratic, but they cannot be credited with any significant long-term achievement as such. If you look at the observations made by different authorities, for example, Rolla H. Bainton paints Anabaptism as left wing of the Reformation, and that is very evident from the way we talked about democratic instincts and principles on which it sought to foist the paraphernalia of religion and religiosity under Christendom. George H. Williams calls Anabaptists as radical Reformation. So these epithets actually come on account of their political and religious outlook and the stance towards the lower order, which was very favorable so far as Anabaptists are concerned. Anabaptists overall were very disrespectful of external authority. They rejected the idea of infants being baptized in favor of baptism when you become an adult. So there is much of a sense of volition by which you get baptized, and if you get baptized as an infant, your choice is not important. So you can see the element of democracy, the element of democratization in this. Anabaptists argued for common ownership of property. Just look at the radical programs that Anabaptists had. They had emphasis on pacifism and non-resistance, and no wonder Zwingli, who was active as another you can say wing of Protestant movement, was quite opposed to the Anabaptists. In fact, Anabaptists' emphasis on the doctrine of election and pronounced feeling of predestination for those who were infused with the Holy Spirit made them quite popular with the lower classes of population, and therefore in quite a few peasant wars they are supposed to have played a significant role, a formidable role. As I told you, that Anabaptists represented the radical wing of reformative assertion, and they are quite popular in the lower rungs of the society. Now, so we have seen in our earlier discussions what do we mean by Lutheran revolt, what do we mean by Calvinist or Reformed movement. We in the ongoing lecture have spoken about Anabaptism or radical Reformation. Now, this brings us to the last you can say segment of Reformation, which I told you towards the beginning that quite a few historians don't even regard this as part of Reformation. Nevertheless, as I explained to you that its beginning can be traced even independent of what Luther had to say, what Calvin, Zwingli had to say. So, the reformative push that 16th century received, even prior to that, there were some strands of reformation or modification, some element of progressivism or progressive changes that were sought to be made within Catholic religion, and that is why Counter-Reformation justifies itself as being counted as part of Reformation as a process. So, the Catholic Reformation, or what some historians would prefer to call counter-revolution, as if it was all about a response to whatever was happening as part of Reformation. So, whatever, I mean, if we look at it in entirety, we find there are some important attributes and patterns that can be discerned, and it did bring about some change in Catholic structure and ecclesiastical functioning and so forth. The term itself, Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, refers to the revival within Roman Catholicism in the period following the opening of the Council of Trent, that is 1545. So, this Council of Trent, as we would discover later, is the beginning where some formal attempts are being made to reform the Catholic Church in the face of the heat or opposition generated by reformers like Luther, Calvin, so forth. So, even prior to that, we have some rumblings to reform the Christian Church, to reform the Catholic Church, and that is why it is important and can even stand as independent from Protestantism. The Council of Trent itself introduced many reforms in relation to the conduct of the clergy, ecclesiastical discipline, religious education, missionary activity, and so forth. So, whatever progressive paraphernalia that you get to see as part of Catholic Church actually is a consequence of this heat generated by Reformation and this Council of Trent that we are talking about. And your screen tells you on the slide that ecclesiastical discipline, religious education, missionary activities, conduct of the clergy, they all underwent significant change as a consequence of this. However, there were other stimulants to counter Reformation as a movement as well, and they were reformations of many older religious orders, such as the establishment of new orders such as Jesuits. So, as I told you that even from within the heritage of Catholicism, we have several attempts towards change, and Jesuits, emergence of the new order of Jesuits is a consequence of that. So, it's not as if the entire thrust is coming only from Protestant movement, so far as the urge to reform Catholic Church is concerned. Older works, of course, use the term Counter-Reformation, as if this attempt to reform Catholic Church emerged just to combat the Protestant Reformation and to limit the rising influence of Protestants over Catholic adherents. But new works use the term Catholic Reformation rather than Counter Reformation, because Roman Catholic Church countered the Reformation only partly by reforming itself from within. For example, in Spain and Italy, there were several other dimensions of this change that were over and beyond the pressure generated by Reformation. So, what we find is that counter-reformatory origin can be traced even before the start of Protestantism. The first half of the 16th century was a phase of lamentation of church which was equally shared by Protestants and the Catholics. As I told you in the beginning, that Protestants thought of reforming church in a particular way, at times even by rebelling out of this and giving it a new face altogether, whereas the urge to change was very much there alongside or even prior to the emergence of Protestantism from within Catholicism. So, definitely the pace of this you can say this Reformation or this counter Reformation certainly had gained pace with Protestantism posing a challenge, but that does not mean that there is complete denial of a parallel movement which was not always anti-Reformation. So it had a rhythm of its own, right? And all the urges to change were not as a consequence of what was being said by the reformers or in an effort to combat their rising influence or impact. Counter-Reformation was a successful movement. It appeared in the 1530s and 1540s as if entire Europe would turn Protestant, because that was the most momentous of the decades under Protestantism. But it was this effort of counter reformers which you can say put the vigor and dynamism of Catholic Church, and it changed the scene in a period of less than a century, and when it could have even challenged Calvinism, since by this time Protestantism had turned very stiff and orthodox. So well into a century of counter-reformation, counter-reformatory momentum was so successful that it could have even challenged Calvinism, because by this time, by around say 17th century, even Protestantism had lost its initial momentum and vigor and had turned out to be very stiff and orthodox. And so in 17th century, maybe counter-reformatory sensibilities appeared more luring to people. Main problem of counter-reformation, however, was the lack of educated priests, as they had alienated from Catholic religion over this long period of decay across the medieval times, across the Middle Ages. Bishops had taken up administrative jobs. There was this issue of absenteeism. There was this issue of religious indecisiveness. So all these things did plague the counter-reformation movement as such. Nevertheless, somehow it overcome these limitations and could meet with a fair degree of success by around 17th century. Now, since we spoke of the antecedents leading to this counter Reformation or Catholic Reformation as such, in that it would be better that we just speak of 2-3 such efforts. For example, mendicant friars. They try to link church with people So it was an attempt to bring about that, or bridge that gap which was very much visible on account of the ongoing decaying process of Catholic Church between the church and the people. So they tried to bridge that gap. Their efforts created a threat of popular uprising, and even went beyond bishop's jurisdiction. Therefore, the the Catholic Church came heavy against this, and it was not supported by the church, and hence it failed. But that tells you that there was some kind of an attempt outside the church bureaucracy to bridge the gap that was increasing between the church and the common people. Similarly, we have De Voltia Moderna, which translates into a new way of devotion that was becoming very popular in northwestern Europe in particular, and it is the laymen who took the lead and church officials just followed. This is an instance where, despite trying from the lower levels, we find that this initial effort to reform the Catholic Church also couldn't quite succeed. So the push is coming from the lower levels, from down below, yet it somewhat failed. Another mention can be made of Brotherhood Society. Now, this was mainly for areas in Italy, and here priests took the lead and laymen followed. So, attempts are being made in different parts of Europe to reform the Catholic Church even prior to beginning of Reformation at the behest of Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and so forth. And we are talking about such couple of efforts. Now here it is the piety, it is the sanctification of individual lives rather than mysticism that is being emphasized. So the progressive element of these efforts is very much visible. The example can be cited: oratory of divine love, priest prayers, frequent confessions, communion and charity. It also tried to improve clergy's knowledge. It also tried to emphasize speeches in direct contact with people. These things were later taken up by Counter-Reformation. So, these efforts, which are very much visible in the work Oratory of Divine Love, you can see those impulses. And it is these principles, it is these prescriptions that were latched on to by the counter-reformers, say in 16th and 17th century, but they owe their origin to works that are prior to the beginning of Reformation as such. At this time, of course, Spain was very powerful and the papacy was virtually under Spanish control. The restoration of Pope's strength and supremacy over council was a burning problem, and hence Pope Paul III had to call for a reform commission, and it is the Oratory of Divine Love, the work that we just spoke about, which dominated in the Reform Council that we earlier spoke of 1537. They decided to have a compromise with the Protestant elements so that the empire is not disintegrated, and hence three different councils were called: Councils of Trent, Councils of Constance, and Council of Bastille. So you can see the dates of these, and the Protestants didn't attend these councils, and indirectly it helped the Pope. The council had suggested for centralization of church. The council had suggested for Pope's prerogatives that were highlighted. Bishop's strength between church and Pope was increased as per the deliberations in these councils. So in totality, all these attempts made the Catholic Church more ready for reforms, and this is over and beyond what pressure and heat that was generated by the Protestants. So this lecture was more about the other two variants, Anabaptism and counter you can say movement so far as Protestantism is concerned, and attempts from within the Catholic Church to reform itself, and certainly the pressure of the Protestant movement had quickened the resolve and pace of these reform movements, whether from outside or from inside. So that should give you a more rounded picture of the Reformation, the phenomena that was very much relevant in 16th and 17th century European history. Thank you.